The body was designed with four types of tissues, and one of these tissues is going to be containing two types of cells or two groups of cells, of which one of these cells is going to be excitable, can conduct electrical impulses, and one of them is going to be more doing of supporting cells, and of course going to be having a lot of other cells doing the supporting role. And this type of the tissue, which is in the body, is what we call the nervous tissue. Good evening to you all. TUMNAD is in front of you, and today we are going to be focusing on what we call the histology of the nervous system. And during the study of the histology of the nervous system, we are going to be focusing on what we call the nervous tissue. Okay? And when we talk of the histology, we are going to be dealing with a section of the nervous tissue. We cut it and zoom and look at it critically at a cellular level. Okay? Now, when you cut a nervous tissue, you zoom in, we are going to be seeing very many type of cells, but we are going to be categorizing them into two forms, okay? There are two categories of cells that are going to be making up what we call the nervous tissue. The first one, which is very, very important, is what we call the neuron. Okay, is what we call the neuron. That is one category of the cells which are going to be contained in the nervous tissue. The second category is going to be what we call the glial cells. Okay, what we call the glial cells, and then the neuron cells. Okay, but we have these glial cells. They can also be called the neuroglia. The neuroglia. Okay, they can also be called the neuroglia cells. So what is unique with these two cells? These two cells are very, very, very unique. What is the unique feature with them? These neuron cells, they are conducting cells. They can conduct electrical impulses. These ones, they cannot conduct electrical impulses. Okay? For that reason, the key features that make the neuron cells different from glial cells is that these neuron cells, they can conduct, okay, they can conduct electrical impulses. Okay, they can conduct electrical impulses. These ones does not conduct electrical impulses. In other words, these ones, they are doing more of what we call support. Okay, in other words, these ones are more of support cells. Okay, they are not doing the same thing. Okay, these kind of the neurons, they are excitable. Okay, they are excitable. Okay, they are excitable. And when we talk of being excitable, we have two types of cells in the whole body that can be excitable. We have the neurons and also the muscle cells. It means that these kind of cells, they can allow the flow of electrical impulses, what we call action potentials. Okay, and then another thing is that the neurons, we are going to be having a lot of the neurons. You can ask yourself, how many neurons do you expect to be contained in a normal human being? Actually, we have billions of the neurons. Okay, so I can say you are billionaires as far as the neurons are concerned. Okay, so we are billionaires in terms of neurons, not money. Okay, so we have approximately the body can contain approximately 100 plus billions. Okay, billions of neurons. Okay, billions of neurons. We have over 100 billions plus of neurons in our body. Okay, another thing is that these neurons, they have high metabolic rate. Okay, neurons have high high metabolic high metabolic rate. What do I mean by this? That these neurons, they need constant supply of what we call glucose, and also at the same time oxygen. Okay, because we realize that the main source of energy for the brain is what we call glucose. So they need constant supply of what we call the glucose and the oxygen. Okay, and when we come to the support cells, we said that the support cells are the glial cells, or what we call the neuroglia. We shall come later on with this and see the different examples of what we call the support cells. So now, having looked at what we call the neuron cells, let us look at what are some of those parts, the typical parts that make up a neuron. Okay, the typical parts, typical the typical parts, of a neuron. Okay, so now what are those typical parts that really make up a neuron? There are mainly three typical parts that make up a neuron. Okay, what are those three parts? The first one is what we call the cell body. The first one is what we call the cell body. You may find some other people calling it the soma. Okay, so you may find some other people calling it the soma. Okay, another type of the parts that make up a typical part of a neuron is what we call the dendrites. Okay, and what we call the dendrites. And the dendrites, we shall talk later. We extract and draw a structure of a neuron. We see all these parts and what they play. Okay, but for your information is that at the dendrites, they are going to be now the structure or the extension from the cell body that receive electrical impulses and forward it to the cell body. Okay. And then the last part, which is very typical for a neuron, is what we call the axon. Okay, is what we call the axon. And of course, the axon is going to be an extension. It's going to be an extension from the cell body that conducts electrical impulse all over up to the axon terminal. Okay, so now in other words, you're going to be having two extensions from the cell body. Okay, the two extensions from the cell body, we have the dendrites and then we have the axons. These two extensions from the cell body collectively they can be called these two can collectively be called neuritis. Okay, they can also be called neuritis. Okay, these two extensions from the cell body, the likes of the dendrites and then the axon, collectively they can call neuritis. Okay, such a beautiful thing. Okay, now, having looked at this, let's have now quickly look at what we call the classification of the different types of, or the classification of neurons. Okay, it is just such a beautiful thing to know that neurons can be classified into several classes. Okay, so let's briefly look at what we call classification of neurons. Okay, classification of neurons. So now basically there are very many classifications of neurons, but we are going to be focusing mainly on two classifications of neurons. We can classify neurons. Number one, we can classify neurons according to functional. Okay, you may even call it functional classification. Okay, functional classification. We can classify neurons according to their functions. Okay, and under this classification, we have the following. We have what we call sensory neuron. We have what we call the sensory neuron. We have a sensory neuron. Number two, we have what we call the motor neuron. And then the last one is what we call the interneuron. Okay, the interneuron. So now, when we talk about classification of neurons according to the functional classification, we have the sensory neuron, and these sensory neurons, they are the ones which are going to be picking the signals or the electrical impulses and feed it to the central nervous system. Okay, that's their main role. When we talk about the motor neuron, these neurons, they are going to be picking the motor responses from the central nervous system to the far end, or to the what we call the effector, like the glands and then the skeletal muscles and other structures. Okay, meaning that they are the transporters of the command from the central nervous system. Okay, And of course, when we talk about the interneuron, these interneurons are going to be located also in the central nervous system. We have these interneurons mainly on what we call the spinal cord, okay? Because these interneurons, they are going to be located between the sensory neuron and then the motor neuron. They are going to be the connectors of the two neurons. If you remember very well what we call the simple reflex arc, the sensations coming from the sensory neuron, they enter through what we call the dorsal horn, or the dorsal horn, or what we call the dorsal root ganglia, and then they synapse with the interneuron, of which the interneuron will now communicate to what we call the motor neuron, as it brings what we call the response to the effectors. Okay, it's such a cool thing. Okay, so now these are the classification of what we call the neurons basing on what we call functional. Okay, now the second one is what we call structural classification. Okay, what we call structural is what we call structural classification. Okay, structural classification. And when we talk about structural classification, we are going to be looking at this neuron having different kind of shapes, okay? Having different types of what we call the extensions, having a lot of, some of them are going to be having a lot of processes than the other, okay? In other words, under what we call structural classification of neurons, we are going to be having also a couple of them. The first one, which I want you to know, is what we call multipolar neuron. Okay, and when we talk of multipolar neuron, this neuron is going to be having a lot of extensions, more especially what we call the dendrites. Okay, this one's going to be having multiple of the dendrites. Okay, but of course, what you need to know that a neuron has only and only one axon, but the dendrites can be very many depending on the type of the neuron. Okay, and mainly multipolar neuron, the best example which you can know, okay, is what we call the motor neuron. Okay, and of course the motor neuron is going to be constituting the biggest percentage of the neuron in what we call the nervous tissue. Okay, what is going to be under the structural classification? We have what we call the bipolar neuron. Okay, and when we talk of the bipolar neuron, this one is going to be having only and only one extension from the cell body of what we call the dendrite. It's going to be having a single dendrite, and these kind of bipolar neurons, they are going to be residing in what we call the retina. Retina are going to be having these kind of the neurons, and also some part of what we call the olfactory epithelium. We are going to also be having what we call these kind of neurons. Okay, and then the third one is what we call pseudo unipolar neuron. And when we talk of the pseudo unipolar neuron, these neurons are also super very important in the way that they are going to be a bit very funny. Okay, they are very funny in the way that they are going to be more part of what we call the sensory neuron. If you remember the sensory neuron, which picks the information to the spinal cord, it has what we call the cell body, which is going to be at the side. Okay, it's going to be having a long peripheral process with a very short central process. But in between them, we have the lateral cell body, okay? And a group of the cell bodies outside the central nervous system is what we call a ganglia, okay? So now these pseudopolar neurons, they are going to be much more of what we call the sensory neurons, which are going to be picking the information from the far ends to the central nervous system, mainly what we call the spinal cord, okay? Talking about the structural classification, these are the really main structures that are going to be under the classification of what we call the structural classification. Okay, so now we are going to be having another video where we are going to be seeing these neurons structurally, and we see how are they different from one another. Okay, so now let's quickly talk about what we call the glial cells. And we have just said that the glial cells, these are also called the neuroglia. They are the support cells. They do not conduct electrical impulse. Okay, do not conduct. Okay, do not conduct electrical impulses. Okay, they do not conduct electrical impulses. We have these glial cells. Some of them are going to be residing in the central nervous system only, while others are going to be residing in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, those ones which are going to be in the central nervous system, they cannot be in the peripheral nervous system. So let's have a look at the glial cells in the central nervous system. Okay, let us look at what we call the glial cells in the central nervous system. What are those examples of glial cells in the central nervous system? I will start with one of the beautiful ones, is what we call the astrocyte. Okay, is what we call the astrocytes. These astrocytes are super cool and very important in the way that they are shaped like the star, okay? And they are serving a very beautiful role. And one of the main roles is going to be protection. They are going to be serving a role of protection. These kind of astrocytes, they are the one which are going to be forming what we call the blood-brain barrier. Okay, form the blood-brain barrier. If you remember very well the blood-brain barrier, the astrocytes they play a big role in the formation of blood-brain barrier, and also what we call regulation of what we call potassium buffering. What we call potassium buffering. Okay, potassium buffering. We shall come later and extract only the astrocyte and zoom it and go much into detail and see how it is going to be forming what we call the blood-brain barrier and also what we call the potassium buffering. Okay. So let's look at the second type of the cell, which is going to be residing in what we call the central nervous system. The second one is what we call ependimal cells. Okay, is what we call ependymal cells. These ependymal cells are super cool and very beautiful in a way that they are going to be residing in what we call the ventricles of the brain. We remember we said that the brain has four types of ventricles. We have the two lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Each of them have what we call the ependymal cells, which are going to be forming what we call the choroid plexus. And of course, once I say that, these ependymal cells, they are going to be playing a role. They are going to be playing a role in what we call CSF production. Okay, they are going to play a role in what we call CSF production. It is such a beautiful thing. Okay, so now these ependymal cells, they are going to be playing that role. Okay, what other cells are located in central nervous system and they are part of the glial cells? We have what we call microglia. Okay, we have these cells called microglia. It sounds very beautiful. Okay, and of course microglia, these are going to be more of what we call the phagocytes. Okay, and when I talk about the phagocytes, what will come in your mind is what we call immunity. For that reason, these microglia cells, being in the central nervous system, they are going to be playing a role in what we call immune role. Okay, they are going to be playing a role in what we call immunity. They are going to be now the traffic officers, doing a very beautiful role in what we call the central nervous system. Okay, so now what other cells are going to be a part of the glial cells and they are located in the central nervous system? We have this kind of a cell that's going to be myelinating the axons of the different neurons. How do we call that kind of the cell that produces the myelin sheath in the central nervous system? It's what we call oligodendrocytes. Okay, this cell is what we call oligodendrocytes. And of course, this beautiful cell, what they do is they form what we call, or they produce what we call the myelin fish. Okay, they produce what we call the myelin sheath. And of course, a myelin sheath is going to be a fatty substance that appears white and is going to be part of what we call what makes the axon to be the white. Okay, what appears white. In other words, a white matter. Okay, the bundles of axon, they appear white, and for that reason, they are considered to be white matter. Okay, it's such a beautiful thing. And another beautiful thing is that one oligodendroid cell, it can myelinate multiple axons. Okay, that is something which is very beautiful and very unique with other cells which you're going to be seeing in the peripheral nervous system. One oligodendrocyte cell can myelinate multiple axons. Okay, so it can myelinate multiple axons. Okay, it's such a beautiful thing. So now we have seen that these glial cells are only going to be playing a role of support in what we call the central nervous system. Let's quickly look at what we call some of those beautiful cells that are going to be residing in the peripheral nervous system. What do you think? We have that beautiful cell that produces the myelin sheath only in the peripheral nervous system. How do we call that cell? It's a beautiful cell with a very beautiful name, and that beautiful name is what we call Schwann cell. Repeat, Schwann cell. Okay? For what? It's what we call Schwann. What we call the Schwann cell. And of course, as we have said, this guy is going to be responsible for producing the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. Okay? It's going to be producing the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. It's such a beautiful thing. Okay? So what else? What other cell? What other glial cell? Okay? What other glial cell in the peripheral nervous system? We have another cell in the peripheral nervous system. This cell is also very cool in a way that it is also super very important in protecting what we call the cell bodies, more especially in what we call the ganglia. And how do we call these cells? These cells are going to be wrapping around the ganglia. If you remember very well, during a reflex arc, we have what we call the dorsal root ganglia. A ganglia, we said, is a collection, a group of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system, meaning that it is residing in the peripheral nervous system. So now, these kind of cells that are going to be protecting these ganglia, these cells are called what we call satellite. Okay, they are called what? They are called satellite cells. Okay, and of course, these cells are going to be, we are going to be seeing them doing what we call protection of the ganglia. Okay, they are going to do what we call protection of what we call the ganglia. If you remember very well, what we call the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so we shall later come back and extract these cells and dig into the detail and understand how they do all these functions we have just listed above. Okay, and having looked at all that, we have just seen the introduction of the histology of the nervous system. Let's have just a very quick recap of what we have just discussed. We have said that we have extracted a nervous tissue, and we have now examined it at a microscopic level. We want to see those kind of cells that are going to be located in that nervous tissue. Okay, when we zoom in, we are going to be seeing two categories of cells. The first category is going to be the neuron cells, and another one is going to be the glial cells, or what we call the neuroglia. We have said the neuron cells. These neuron cells are going to be the conducting cells. They are going to be the excitable cells. We have a number of them. We have billions and billions of these neuron cells. Okay, these neuron cells, they have high metabolic rate. For that reason, they need the constant supply of oxygen and glucose, because their main source of energy is glucose. Okay, so now these neurons are super very important. Now we went ahead and classified these neurons. We classified them according to the function, also classified them according to the structure. We said functional classification, we have what we call the sensory neurons that feeds the sensory information to the central nervous system. We went ahead and said that we have the motor neurons that feeds the information from the central nervous system to the far peripherals. Okay? In other words, if this is our central nervous system, okay, if this is our central nervous system, the sensory neurons, they're going to be feeding the information to the central nervous system. Okay, they are going to be feeding the information to the central nervous system, while the motor neurons, they are going to be picking the motor responses to the far effectors for a corrective response. Okay, and we said that the interneurons, they are going to be connecting the motor neuron to the sensory neuron, especially during what we call a simple reflex arc. We said that we can also classify them by structural classification, whereby we said we have the multipolar neuron that are going to be having multiple dendrites. Okay, and for example, what we call the motor neuron, which constitutes the biggest number of the neurons in the nervous tissue. Okay, then we said we also have what we call the bipolar neuron, and of which this bipolar neuron, they're going to be having only one dendritic extension, and they're going to be mainly in what we call the retina and other areas. We also said that we have what we call the pseudo-unipolar neurons, which are going to be part of what we call the sensory neurons, more especially in those areas which we are calling the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, it's such a cool thing. We went ahead and said that the glial cells, they are support cells. They do not conduct electrical impulses. These glial cells, they are going to be more of the support cells, and they're going to be located in different areas of the central nervous system. Those ones which are good, those glial cells which are in the central nervous system, we said we have the astrocytes that are playing a role of structural and protection, formation of blood-brain barrier, and also what we call regulation or what we call potassium buffering. So come later and extract and see how it is going to be doing what we call potassium buffering. We said we also have what we call the ependimal cells that are residing in the ventricles of the brain, doing a job of what we call production of cerebrospinal fluid. We also said that we also have what we call the microglia, which are the immune phagocytic cell that does the process of phagocytosis. And for that reason, they are going to be playing a role of immunity. We said we also have these cells that are producing the myelin fish, okay, in the central nervous system, which we call oligodendrocytes. We said that these cells are very unique in a way that one oligodendrocyte cell can myelinate multiple axons. It is such a beautiful thing, okay? Then we said that we also have glial cells which are going to be located in the peripheral nervous system. The first one we said we have the swan cell, which is going to be producing the myelin fish in the peripheral nervous system. It can only myelinate only one axon, one swan cell to one axon. Okay, it's also different from what we call the oligodendrocytes. Okay, it's such a beautiful thing. Then we said we also have what we call the satellite cells, which are going to be wrapping around what we call the cell bodies in what we call the dorsal root ganglia and other ganglias. Of course, we said that the ganglia, those are the collection, the group of neuron cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay, having covered all that, we shall come later and extract what we call all these ones. We now look at them individual neuron. We are going to be coming and now talk about the science of the neurons. We dive into the neuron and we see how these neurons, how are they differing from one another in the next part, which is part 2. I can say you are early, you are too early for the next part 2. Thank you very much for listening. And if you think whatever I've just talked about is making sense, is adding to you, please, why can't you support me? And you can support me by a couple of means. You can like the video, comment in the comment section. You can share the video to the people whom you think it is helpful. And don't forget, subscribe at the end of it all. Thank you very much for watching TUMNAD. As always, until we meet next time.